Dragon Ball GT Final Bout may just be one of the worst video games I have ever played in my entire life. Welcome back to finding the worst Dragon Ball game, the series that I definitely didn't abandon over half a year ago. The last game we covered was Dragon Ball Z Sagas, a horrible experience. And today, we're covering Dragon Ball GT Final Bout, an equally, if not worse, experience. Leave a comment down below suggesting another bad Dragon Ball game, and I'll cover whatever game the top comment says. Now, on to the main event. Dragon Ball GT Final Bout is one of the worst video games I've ever played. But before I complain too much, let's take a look at the history of GT Final Bout, because there is some weird stuff going on here. Final Bout released on the PlayStation in Japan on August 21st, 1997, and released in North America 2 months later on October 1st. It's most often cited as the first Dragon Ball game to be officially released in North America, which technically isn't true. Dragon Power is an NES game released in the US in 1988. However, it was first released in Japan in 1986 under the name Dragon Ball Shenron no Nazo. The American version was stripped of any Dragon Ball licensing and was completely rebranded as a generic fantasy game. This was because Dragon Ball was unknown in the West at the time, as it wouldn't air until 1989 with the first failed test market dub. It wouldn't be until 1995 with Funimation's first English dub of the original series, then their dub of Dragon Ball Z in 2001, that the series would really find its footing. So are we really going to count a completely rebranded Dragon Ball game that's been stripped of everything Dragon Ball as the first Dragon Ball game released in the US? Yeah. So Final Bout is the first Dragon Ball game released in the US to sport the actual Dragon Ball branding, but that doesn't mean there weren't even more problems with air dates and series recognizability. Final Bout released in the US in 1997. While the GT series had already been airing in Japan since 1996, the US was still only airing Dragon Ball Z. GT wouldn't begin airing in the US until 6 years later in 2003, and publisher Bandai knew that since practically no one in the US would know what GT is, they initially only produced 10,000 copies of the game. Those who could get their hands on one of these early copies were left very confused by who most of these characters were, because here in the US, Dragon Ball Z was still on the Namek arc. However, over the next several years as the series grew in popularity in the US, Final Bout stood as the only official Dragon Ball game available. It would go on to grow rapidly in value and become a highly sought after game. So 7 years after its initial release in 2004, after GT had already been airing in the US, Atari, who had acquired the license to publish Dragon Ball games, would reprint Final Bout, giving more players the unfortunate opportunity to finally play it. What's really funny to me is that this is a re-release of a PlayStation 1 game in 2004, when the PlayStation 2 had been out for 4 years now when it released in 2000. But enough about how it was released. What was the consensus on release? Well, as with most of these older titles, we do have a lot of people who played this game as children and are completely blinded by nostalgia, saying that they had fun with it. I dare you to play this game again. Aside from nostalgia, most critics and players alike seem to be in agreement that this game is horrible. One of the worst Dragon Ball games, one of the worst fighting games, one of the worst games. And I have to agree, but it's honestly a shame. This game, whether I like it or not, is a pivotal moment in the history of Dragon Ball games, but that doesn't make it a good game. Alright, enough history lessons, let's get into why this game is dog shit. Dragon Ball GT Final Bout was developed by TOS, who had worked on a number of Dragon Ball games previously, such as the Butoden series. However, while previous entries were 2D fighters, Final Bout made history as the first in the Butoden series, and simply the first overall Dragon Ball game to be fully rendered in 3D. While Ultimate Battle 22, another bad Dragon Ball game, featured 2D sprites against a 3D arena, Final Bout was fully 3D. 3D models and 3D environments. That sure doesn't make it good. This thing plays horribly. Since we're talking about the 3D, let's start with the camera, which just doesn't work. Your field of view is incredibly restricting. When characters get too far apart, such as knocking an opponent back, the camera will focus on one character, completely abandoning the other, so they're just off screen. Characters are constantly being cut off too, like when they fly too high or when they jump back. You never know what the camera's gonna do. And that's not a fun, quirky thing, it's just annoying. Speaking of things just not working, the combat itself is also terrible. I like to say games have janky controls, but the controls here might actually be the jankiest janky controls I've ever played. For starters, the movement feels awful. You can fight on the ground or in the air, but be careful, because if only one fighter is flying, then they'll probably be cut off from view, but the camera will just freak out and not know what to do. You can't run or anything like that, so you need to rely on flying and dashing, unless you just want to walk really slowly in Aura Farm for some reason. You can also move away or towards the camera, but it just feels so clunky to do so, because it doesn't even look like you're moving around the space. And the actual fighting is no better. This game has some of the worst hitboxes I have ever seen. Sometimes basic attacks will hit at a range way wider than they should be able to, but other times look like they should connect and yet no hit is registered. The specials are also annoying too. Your inputs have to be timed perfectly or else they don't register. And it's not even mentioning the fact that there's also insane input delay. So are there any positives to this fighting system? Well, I guess it depends on your definition of positive. Like I mentioned before, it is the first fully 3D rendered Dragon Ball game, which is an important step for future Dragon Ball games. Does that mean it's well done here? No. Is it still important? I guess. There are some cool cinematic moves here, things that would be implemented into future Dragon Ball games, such as meteor smash attacks or beam clashes. The thing is though, these aren't technically new. Sure, Final Bout did them first in 3D, hell it did 3D itself first. And while that's important to note, it doesn't make this game any more playable. Especially since the point of these features is flashy spectacle, and the game looks like this. Presentation-wise, Final Bout is ugly. Now to be fair, it is a PlayStation game that I'm playing in 2026, but come on, other PlayStation games, especially in 1997, didn't look this bad. I also have to call out the atrocious dub and subsequent localization. The dub doesn't feature voice actors from any of the well-known Dragon Ball dubs, such as the Ocean Group dub. Rather, Bandai used an uncredited cast of voice actors, yet at the same time kept the original Japanese voice cast for the in-battle voices, meaning there's different voices for the pre- and post-battle voice lines and for the in-game battle voice lines.
I will now end this.
And for some reason, they also changed the soundtrack too, most notably removing the original theme from the opening and replacing it with a generic rock song. Speaking of the opening, it was animated originally for this game and seems to be everyone's favorite part of this game. I can see why, because it is absolutely nothing like the game itself. In terms of game modes, there isn't much to touch on. There's the standard battle mode, which just functions like an arcade mode, a tournament mode where up to 8, either human or CPU fighters can, like the title suggests, compete in a tournament of single round matches. And finally, build up mode from Ultimate Battle 22 makes a return, wherein your characters will get stronger over time. You can save your characters to a memory card and battle your friends. You can also transfer your character levels from Ultimate Battle 22 to Final Bout. Neat. In terms of characters themselves, there are 17 playable characters, with 7 being unlockable through cheat codes or through build-up mode. A lot of them are just Goku over and over, but that's like every Dragon Ball game out there. And despite the whole hullabaloo about the GT series, the characters here are just a mix of GT and Z characters. Well, that's about it for Dragon Ball GT Final Bout, so let's head on over to my patented bad Dragon Ball games tier list. Looking back on this tier list, I honestly wish I could move some of these around, but that's not the nature of this game, so I'm locked into this. When I played Sagas, I didn't think things could get that much worse, but here we are. Final Bout, despite a cool opening movie, is just garbage. It's one of the jankiest fighters out there, the camera doesn't work, inputs don't work, it doesn't look good, it doesn't sound good, it functions at least, kind of. I'll admit it has its place in the history of Dragon Ball games, standing as the first officially licensed Dragon Ball game in the US, and the first fully 3D Dragon Ball games, but those aren't good reasons to play it, and they definitely don't make the game play any better. And for that, this is going in the feces tier, below Sagas, where it will, as of now, be the worst Dragon Ball game. Comment down below another bad Dragon Ball game, and I'll cover whichever one the top comment says in the next episode. I'll try not to take another 6 months, but no promises.